Hello students, today we are here to discuss the unit on international ethics, and we've divided this unit into two parts and we're here to discuss the first part. First, let's introduce international ethics. In today's world, we live in constant interactions with other countries, which is why we need a solid system of international ethics. International ethics can be defined as a code of norms that provides us with insights to assess the good and the harms, the right and the wrongs, which can occur in international interactions between nations and non-governmental international organizations. It's often the case that countries that are powerful in terms of their resources want to dictate the terms over poorer countries. It's where international ethics is most needed to ensure a sense of harmony and justice in interaction with other nations. Ethics primarily deals with the question of the good. Normative ethics asks the question of what ought to be rather than what is the case. Decisions need to be made just not for the benefit of some nations but for the greater good of the global society. Various agencies of the UN, by their presence and action in various countries, promote certain universal principles that transcend the boundaries of individual nations and ethical principles pursued by individual nations. Various agencies of the UN, by their presence and action in various countries, promote certain universal principles that transcend the boundaries of individual nations and ethical principles pursued by individual nations. International ethic is not simply an ethic of some dominant country because of the power they have over others. It is about finding the good and right in every international interaction and evaluating what is best for the global community. Now, international ethics developed as a result of international relations post World War II and the Cold War. It's important for us to understand what are the primary reasons for which we need international ethics. First, international ethics is that which enables one to participate more actively in shaping and building a good international community. A good international community is where decisions and actions are taken for the greater good in mind, where there is social justice and peaceful coexistence. Second, we need international ethics to understand the challenges of the international community. Challenges are inevitable because distribution of resources is different in different parts of the world, and there's often a balance of power that has to be built in such situations. Now, we need international ethics to delineate a common ground of ethics that shape the code of interaction between different countries. We need to evaluate whether the international community promotes peace and justice and how it can bring about more peace and justice in the global society. Further, we need to evaluate how the global community uses shared resources and whether their actions of consumption are ethical or not. Now, international ethics comes about in an international space, and we need to understand how the international space has developed. International space, as we have seen, refers to interaction between nations. It also refers to the rise of multinational organizations. Over time, today we see more interconnectedness between people and nations. We see greater interdependence and greater shared responsibilities that have emerged through these interactions. Today, we see government and non-government organizations having ownership and control over issues and aspects that are central to our shared life in this global community. There have been democratic governmental organizations as well as non-democratic governmental organizations interacting and coexisting in the global space. There are also profit business corporations like MNCs, TNCs, etc. and non-profit governmental organizations which operate in the international space. Now, we need to understand in detail what is this international space and what does it entail. Now, international or global space refers to the interaction and obligation between nations, and also it refers to the goods and services that are public commons. For example, oceans, polar regions, atmosphere, outer space, today even the internet, which is cyberspace, are some of these examples of global commons. Collective goods and services that are owned or controlled by more than one individual or organization also comes under the international space. Collective good refers to goods that benefit individuals belonging to the same group, where it's hard to exclude any individual from that specific benefit. For example, every country has an interest in stopping global warming, a goal that can be achieved by many countries acting together. Yet each country also has individual interests in burning fossil fuels and keeping its economy going. Similarly, members of a military alliance benefit from the strength of the alliance, but each member separately also has an interest in minimizing its own contributions in its troops and money. Individual nations can advance their own short-term interests by seizing territory, cheating on trade agreements, etc. However, in order to act ethically towards the collective good of many nations coming together, nations have to often keep their short-term goals and interests aside and work towards the collective good of the society. International space is low on individual power over nature and social world, but are high on the coalition of collective powers. One example of this coalition of collective powers is the Bretton Woods institutions, which are the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The Bretton Woods institution is an agreement between 44 countries which provides us a framework for economic cooperation and development that leads to a more stable and prosperous global economy. Now, another aspect of international space is who is excluded from the international space and who is included in the international space. The reasons and rationality of those exclusions and inclusions have a bearing on the expanding nature of the international space and the quality of international relations within it. Now, what does it mean for us to study international ethics in the context of international space? International ethics helps us to acknowledge and recognize the power that human beings in coalition with each other have over nature, economic and social goods. International ethics are needed to keep a check on how different organizations may be working on counter purposes or be competitive, or in worst cases even be at war with each other. International ethics are needed to keep a check on power imbalances between nations and what harms are done between one another. Then international spheres and relations can easily thrive in a global system renewed constantly by greater levels of sensitivity and reflection on international ethics. An important understanding of ethics in the international space needs to be through the international economy, as it is a major aspect of the international interaction and community. International economy entails the exchange of money supply, goods, resources and services. A big resource of exchange in the international economy is the human resource. The economy of nations prospers when there is a flow of ideas and resources between nations. A nation that might have been self-sufficient at some point in history might need to change its international relation policies once a large number of its population ages. There might have to be more flexible in terms of migration policies and also be open to multicultural societies. International trade is also a big aspect of international economy, as it promotes interdependence upon nations, flow of human capital from one nation to another, globalization and so on. There is thus a requirement for certain institutions that facilitate this growth and provide the ethical guidance necessary for growth and maturity for stronger international relations. Examples of such institutions are the United Nations, which has the United Nations Ethics Office. Then there is the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and then there are even smaller coalition of nations with certain common interests that strengthen their power on the international front. Examples of that are the BRICS nation. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India and South Africa, which are economically developing nations that were said to have the potential of becoming the most dominant economies by 2050. Another example is the ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asia Nations, an alliance between Southeast Asian nations to facilitate economic, political, security, military and socio-cultural integration. Even the European Union is another example of political and economic union. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, is another example between US, Canada, Mexico. These are all examples of strategic alliances between nations, but one may differ from another on the basis of the methodology, rules, relationships of the agreement, etc. As we know, theoretical ethics are predominantly divided as normative ethics, applied ethics, and meta-ethics. In practical situations like international ethics, we often see an overlap of these various dimensions of ethics. Ethics in terms of the international economy, which we're right now discussing, have various aspects that can come under business ethics, which is a common domain under applied ethics. And generally speaking, global economy works through interhuman and cultural relationships which encompass all moral relationships. Then there are some normative issues concerning human rights, fairness and justice that are applicable in international interactions, which also apply to policies of trade and migration, laws for migrant laborers, corrupt practices like money laundering, etc. Another important aspect that needs to be weighed in ethical terms is that of environmental ethics. Private and intergovernmental interactions often look at economic transactions without considering the harm done to environment, space, atmosphere, and so on. This is a major aspect that needs to be seriously considered before nations place political and economic demands over one another. Thus, we understand that nations have a relationship of competition, obligation, conflict, interdependence with and towards one another. At the same time, all interactions also have an effect upon the global community and the shared space. An interesting problem in bioethics that the world has recently witnessed is that of the COVID-19 pandemic. International ethical values have been extremely necessary in guiding vaccine innovation and distribution, in attempting to help people with the greatest need, reducing health disparity, saving the most lives, and so on. There have been ethical dilemmas around what is a fair and equitable way to distribute a limited supply of vaccines. Should each nation distribute doses only to its own population, or should some form of global distribution occur? If global distribution takes place, what values and criteria ought to govern? The issue has been extremely pressing because only a limited number of nations have been manufacturing the vaccine, and the pandemic as a global crisis requires from all nations to help each other to survive it. In the pandemic, we have seen nations and private stakeholders come together to set up initiatives that provide protection to low and middle income countries, for which they are given. The issue has been extremely pressing because only a limited number of nations have been manufacturing the vaccine, and the pandemic as a global crisis requires aid from all nations to help each other to survive it. In the pandemic, we have seen nations and private stakeholders come together to set up initiatives that provide protection to low and middle income countries. Economic leverage is insufficient to ensure the immunity of their people. Moving away from the pandemic to issues that have endured over time, when we speak of international ethics, we need to understand ethical parameters of looking at how we treat nature, repercussions like global warming, climate change that we're facing due to our actions. When we speak of environmental ethics in philosophy, we divide them into two approaches to these ethics. One is the anthropocentric approach and the other is the ecocentrism approach. The former is an approach to ethics based on how nature has value for humans, and the latter is the view that nature has intrinsic value irrespective of the human perspective. Also, the ethical aspect of climate change and other environmental issues is connected to the temporal dimension by the concern of intergenerational equity, the responsibility of the present human population to preserve the biosphere as the heritage for future generations. Another important aspect that needs to be considered is international law. We see that international law is often conditioned upon international ethics, and one of the very important aspects, as we've been consistently discussing, is that of peace. Thus, we should throw some light on the law of peace. The Article 1 of the United Nations Charter states that one of the purposes of the United Nations is to bring about, by peaceful means and in conformity with principles of justice and international law, adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of the peace. The rule of law ensures that international law and the principles of justice apply equally to all states and are equally adhered to. For nations to cooperate, collaborate, and to be interdependent on each other, the fundamental condition basis which all international law exists needs to be peace. The law of peace regulates peaceful relations and includes subject matters as international treaty law, the law of diplomatic and consular relations, international organizational law, the law of state responsibility, the law of the sea, the environment and outer space and international economic law, etc. Actions need to be evaluated on the basis of whether they promote peaceful coexistence among nations or not. Peace needs to be an important consideration in evaluating whether an action is ethical or not. In the same context, we need to understand diplomatic relations. Diplomacy is about management of power relations of a group of nations. Diplomacy is commonly understood as the art and practice of conducting negotiations between representatives of states. It also refers to the conduct of international relations through mediation of professional diplomats with regard to a full range of topical issues. Nations sometimes resort to international arbitration when faced with a specific question or point of contention in need for resolution. Diplomatic initiatives are there for nations to resolve their differences and to come to agreements that ensure peace and security, and also to further their rights and interests and to share duties and responsibilities. Diplomacy rests on plurality and on a preference for dealing peacefully rather than forcefully. Thus, in each country recognizing the other, there is the international law of peace, even though it may not resolve all conflicts between nations. Another important aspect that needs to be viewed through the lens of international ethics is that of defense and military enterprises in nations. Power and dominance of one nation over another is an important aspect of international ethics. This issue has many aspects like the ethics of International Arms Trade Act, matters of national defense that need to be seen through an ethical lens, taking action and being subject to media scrutiny, pacifism, mistreatment of prisoners of war, and so on. Military ethics as applied ethics have as the most important points of reference constitutional law honoring international law and the law of armed conflict and the conscience of the individual soldier. The United Nations is today's global authority for safeguarding these laws. This means that states may engage in military force only within frameworks set by the UN Charter. There are two legitimate reasons, namely the right of a state or an alliance to self-defense and military measures approved by the UN Security Council for a threat to peace or violation of peace. Now, moving from military and peace considerations is another aspect that needs to be viewed through the ethical lens, which is the poverty and wealth of nations. Though poverty is an internal matter of the nation, it does influence international participation, action, and general interaction with other nations. Poverty is not just an issue of deprivation in terms of low income, but it also includes its implications like poor health conditions, low quality of education, clean water, food, etc. It begs the question of what ethical reasons and justifications are there for the 10% of the world's population holding 90% of the world's wealth and resources. In terms of ethics, the principle of justice is most relevant as severe poverty poses a moral challenge over wealthier nations to make an effort to improve and uplift vulnerable populations. Thus, poverty poses a direct threat upon global justice. The World Bank and the UNDP are two multilateral development organizations where poverty and ethics or human rights have been explicitly in their focus. International ethics requires one to eradicate the disparity between nations and help channelize ways in which more resourceful nations can help poorer nations to bridge their disparity. Another aspect that needs to be viewed through the ethical perspective is that of the inevitable inequality of nations. Disparities abound in access to needs such as shelter, land, food and clean water, sustainable livelihoods, technology, and even information. Inequalities in all of these realms pose challenges to human security and environmental sustainability. Inequality between countries using aggregate economic indicators such as gross domestic product per capita, sometimes weighed by national populations, these measures of global inequality are limited because they implicitly assume that within country distributions of income are perfectly equal. The gap between rich and poor has increased dramatically over the last few decades within particular countries such as USA and Canada, and also across countries with extremes of wealth and poverty such as the USA and Congo. Thus, we have seen certain problems of international relations that require to be evaluated from the lens of international ethics. Now let's get into some primary theories of ethics in the context of international ethics. Number one, a primary theory of ethics is normative ethics. We often look at three approaches to ethical problems. The first approach that is taken is the deontological ethics approach. In deontological ethics, the means of the action are equally important to the ends. Actions are not merely done for achieving certain ends. Deontological ethics also point towards how we have a certain duty towards acting morally and in the interest of the greater good rather than personal gain. Another important approach to ethical theory is that of the utilitarian approach, where an action is considered ethical if it benefits the majority of people. Utilitarian ethics are often focused on achieving a set of goal or end in mind. The third approach taken in ethics is that of virtue ethics. The origin of virtue ethics is in the works of Aristotle. Virtue ethics promotes a sense of balance and virtues that makes an individual better and works towards the greater good of the society. In virtue ethics, justice is seen as one of the most important values that needs to be perfected to make a better society. These are three important approaches within ethics that need to be understood in order to evaluate various situations in international relations. In conclusion to this part, we understand that ethics is about values, standards, principles, and our choices that are dependent on our values, standards, and principles. In today's world, what is global is connected to the local, and what is local is connected to the global and has an ethical implication for the entire global community. Every action in international relation needs to be questioned in terms of what is right. There needs to be a constant debate in terms of what is good, in form of whether an action is right or wrong, whether it promotes peace or justice or not. Thus, we understand that all international actions need to be humanitarian in nature. There needs to be a preference given to what is good and right, rather than a dominance of the powerful nations and an imbalance of power between them. The nature of inquiry in international relations is normative, which is that there is always a desire, or there always needs to be a desire to understand what ought to be, where we focus on the ought rather than what is. Ethics in international relations is extremely important to continue the debate between rights and interests, which influence not just our present but also our future generations.